Okay, so I'm going to jump right into this because we've got literally two of the smartest guys that I know who do market research in our industry. I've got 25 minutes and 12 questions. So to my immediate left here is Dean Bubley, the founder of Disruptive Analysis. Many of you read his work. And Benoit Felton, who's joining us at PTC for the very first time. He's the CEO and founder of Diffraction Analysis. And as I mentioned, both of these guys are whip smart, highly experienced, been in the business forever, and I know you can benefit from their insight. So let me just start out with a battery of questions and ask you to rapid fire answer as well as you can. Greatest opportunity for connectivity providers next 5 years?
Getting the balance right between wholesale and retail services, and not thinking that you can do everything. There will be certain enterprise verticals, certain consumer services, but focus and pragmatism is the biggest opportunity and also risk.
Super.
Understanding that infrastructure can be deployed on different terms than the current telco terms, and that this is how we will get universal connectivity without all this public money that's been disturbing the field.
Follow-up question, next 5 years, the biggest threat to the connectivity industry?
Believing hype and getting the timing wrong. So 5G in particular is a pet topic of mine. There's a lot of visions which might be realistic on 10-year view. If everything else stayed the same, it won't, because in a 3-year view, there's a bunch of other things outside telecoms that really change the game. AI, silicon, issues around regulatory, security, all of those are likely to derail plans. And if people think that things like network slicing and ubiquitous 5G will be here in 2022, they're wrong, and they need to focus on what will be, rather than the wishful thinking.
Benoit?
Erosion of competition. I think the combination of misunderstood fiber business models and 5G coming in requiring a whole lot of deep fiber connectivity will mean that a lot of existing market players who have workable business models will not be able to invest, which means that we will get two things happening: a lot of consolidation to the point of recreating monopolies potentially, and also we will get a bigger digital divide because there will be no incentive for people who know they won't have any competition to invest in areas where they're not going to make the maximum profit.
And so my opinion is always that enough revenue solves every problem that we've got. What is the biggest new revenue source that you guys see on the horizon?
I think in my world, a lot of it comes from enterprise, and that's both B2B and B2C, particularly around mobility, but not exclusively. And particularly here, not necessarily to the normal telcos and operators, but perhaps by niche new entrants in industrial, in road and rail, and other sectors. And there's going to be a lot of interesting regulatory wrinkles here as to who gets licenses on what terms, who buys a wholesale relationship, who gets a slice of however you describe it. But I think it's collectively the networks and communications industry will have more revenues, but it's not going to necessarily accrue just to the same, historical culprits that we're expecting.
I need to distinguish between infrastructure and services again. Infrastructure is stable. Once you get past the initial investment phase, you got steady revenues. There's no problem there. The problem is that telecom operators are not very well suited to address that kind of business model. On the service side, I've been theorizing for a long time that the area in which service providers can distinguish themselves from the Googles and Facebooks of this world is by customer intimacy, simply because that's not something that is viable for any of these large global platforms. The problem is that at the same time, service providers have been basically getting away from intimacy because they see intimacy as a cost. Support for your customers should not be seen as a cost. It should be seen as an opportunity to create intimacy. So I think there needs to be a fundamental shift for those revenues: smart home, home security, all of these things, healthcare, all of that requires a degree of trust that the telcos currently don't have, but they are still theoretically the best position to go after that revenue.
I think there's an interesting question about platforms versus services. And I think there's often a view that the network is a platform that allows you to do everything for everyone. And I think that most telcos, depending on their size and existing customers, will need to pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things to do in depth, make it into either a platform or a portfolio of their own services. And then in others, they will need to relinquish control, work with partners of different sorts. So it might be that one telco picks connected car, healthcare, smart home, and oil and gas, and another one does financial services, railways, smart electric vehicle charging, and something else. But that's going to depend on their market, their competition, the skills they have locally, connectivity internationally, scale of the market. And a lot of the challenge is going to be picking the right ones and looking at the intersections of lots of different technology trends of vehicles, AI, healthcare. Even a Google or a Facebook can't do everything. So pick things which are defensible. There are intersections of 2 or 3 trends.
There is, however, a fundamental difference between these global business models where basically you extract a very small amount of revenue from billions of people and the kind of telco type approach where you extract a relatively large amount of revenue from the people that you connect directly. So if that model is to, if that difference is to keep existing, then they need to build on that intimacy.
As you talk to service providers and their suppliers in the ecosystem, my experience has been that guys are uniformly optimistic. They're aware of the challenges, but they're pretty optimistic about handling them. What are the key strategies that you're seeing them talk about in terms of, well, in 10 years, here's where we want to be, and here's why? And of course, it's different in every country, but what's the range of things that people are talking about?
Well, I would say in a very, generic way, telcos have been in this weird position between pipes and platforms for 10 years, and they need to decide. So if you look at a Hong Kong broadband network, they're in the pipe camp, they're happy to say so, and they're very profitable because they have a very narrow set of skills that they need to have in order to deliver what the customer wants, and they stick to it. They don't try to spend tons of money on, developing other stuff that might generate revenue tomorrow maybe, but other people are doing. They're the only people I've ever spoken to who say, we love Google and Facebook, they do the R&D for us. I mean, that's completely flipped over from what the typical telco would say. On the opposite end, you have some niche players like Altibox in Norway who really have gone down the service route, but they're super intimate services, very high value services. You can't be, Dean's absolutely right. You can't be everything to everyone. You need to pick where you are and then stick to that business model and do it as best you possibly can.
Yeah, and potentially also look outside your traditional domains of selling telecom services. So, the preeminent example is SoftBank, which is more of a technology company, a technology holding company rather than just a telco. It's got telco businesses, but now through the Vision Fund, it owns things like Arm that makes chips, it does robots, it's got right from the telecom network down to silicon design. That's pretty unique. And then on a smaller scale, you've got, say, Elisa in Finland, which as well as running its own network, is starting to sell AI and network automation software and tools to other telcos, because it's developed that in-house and is now realizing that they can offer that as a software service or function for anyone else who needs to automate networks.
I find it's an interesting thing in the analytical community. I tend to find that folks like me and you will say it's pipes or platforms, and you really have to specialize in one or the others. Deloitte will say that as well. On the other hand, most of the equity analysts are really sort of saying pipes, pipes, pipes. It's logical, it's safer. It sort of worries me.
Well, I think particularly in North America, here there is a bit of a variable where there is one service category, which is home TV, and content and entertainment, which is particularly for consumers and particularly for both fixed and mobile broadband. That is a large enough market with tens or hundreds of millions of homes or users, and potentially tens of dollars a month. That's a bit of a one-off. And you compare that with some of the things we're talking about for enterprise or selling software as a service, where you're targeting large businesses or industrial. So I think the content and entertainment, because of the merger of various organizations, particularly in North America, I think that's a bit of a special case.
Still, you got to ask yourself if I was in AT&T's place today, I'd be seriously asking myself, do I need to own my infrastructure in order to deliver what I want to deliver tomorrow? I mean, the biggest part of that business is now Time Warner. So it's the content side. They clearly want to move up. And if they want to move up, there's a point where owning the pipe might not be a strategic decision anymore. And if that is the case, then that's what they should get rid of and let someone run that as a neutral infrastructure, which then means that their content can be distributed everywhere, not just on their own network footprint. So there's something kind of nonsensical in the idea that you would own valuable content and you wouldn't want the maximum number of customers to actually access that and pay you for it. And your network, in a sense, is a walled garden that you create for yourself. So I think we're going to see some shifts in these business models, in the next 5 years, definitely.
I agree that in some cases, this idea that the telco will own all of its own network in all places for all customers for all applications is wrong. You will find that it owns some of it. For example, it could be long-haul fiber, it could be last mile, local loop, it could be certain cell towers, but they will also lean on some combination of wholesale or neutral hosts. It could be a specialist indoor provider because 5G won't always work indoors. It could well be a metropolitan wholesale fiber network in some places because that's what's available. And so I think that you will find this patchwork that the carrier services people will have to deal with. That has a downside. Because you've got this patchwork of multiple networks being glued together, doing things like network slicing or edge computing becomes much, much harder because you end up with the equivalent of a roaming scenario half the time.
But also much more necessary if you want to have some quality of service, like uniform quality of service delivered to your customers. I agree with you, it's complicated and we don't quite know how these bits are going to fit in. But at the same time, the fragmentation of networks is a challenge in and of itself. And I think one of the key aspects of virtualization is going to be how do you operate across networks in a way that we haven't really seen before.
And I think that there's a fundamental tension I see in telecoms between let's have one network with really good QoS and management and control and slicing and all this fun stuff. And then the other view is let's have lots of networks which are fairly cheap. None of them are perfect, but we can glue them all together, arbitrage the price between them. If it's fixed line, SD-WAN, we can just, we get 4 cheap internet connections, throw the same packets down all the connections and take whatever comes out the other end first, rather than one over-engineered solution.
And I almost hate to bring this up in the communications context, but since the 1980s, we have decided that heterogeneous networks and freedom is a better way to get innovation and spur investment and that sort of thing. And on the other hand, most of us who look at the numbers are saying ARPU falling, and in some cases gross revenues falling, and it's commoditization and all that good stuff. So this morning at breakfast, you mentioned the word, remonopolization, which we haven't talked about in several decades, but the marketplace may, in fact, be pushing us towards monopolization on an infrastructure side, and then maybe diversity on the app side.
I mean, you have a perfect example here in the Pacific region. New Zealand went down that route 5 years ago, and it's delivered outcomes that they didn't dream of at the time. I mean, by having a single, not quite national, but let's say 90% of the territory, a single player deploy fiber everywhere, they have boosted their digital economy, way beyond what they expected. I remember going down there and meeting with government back in 2011 when they'd just done it. They were super scared that people were not going to subscribe to fiber, that the demand was not going to be there. And now, Chorus is actually struggling to keep up with deployment because the demand is so strong. So I think that, the recent policy in South Korea to enforce network sharing on 5G backhaul, these things need to be looked at by both private players and public players, because this is not a evil regulator imposing stuff on you. This is how do we get a functional market 5 years from now?
And I think we'll see different versions of that. In some cases, it's going to be sharing for backhaul. In some cases, it's going to be sharing for infrastructure like towers or ducts. And in some cases, it's going to be sharing of spectrum as well. And there's different, and some of this is going to be at a national level, and some of it is going to be at a local level. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on the radio side, CBRS spectrum in the US for localized networks. There's things that are happening in the UK, in Germany, in Japan, that are allowing that, as well as metropolitan authorities looking at rolling out neutral host fiber. One thing I would say, though, to come back to the ARPU decline, I'm not sure a lot of that is down to the competition that people think. A lot of it, frankly, is down to lack of innovation in the telecoms industry. Someone like Amazon or Huawei spends more on R&D than the entire telco industry put together. And frankly, that shows. The results come from that. There's a lot of companies there, the technology companies, that are spending $5, $10, even $15 billion a year on R&D.
And when you say telco, you mean service providers?
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, if you look at the
and their suppliers as well.
Well, no. Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia obviously spend a lot. Qualcomm as well. But if you add up all the R&D, budgets of AT&T and Orange and NTT and China Mobile, it probably comes to about the same as Amazon or slightly less.
And that, of course, I would argue is one of the things that happens when you move from monopoly to competition. You simply don't have the margins anymore to do serious amounts of R&D, right?
Well, I don't know. It's also a matter of willingness, and it's also a matter of understanding where your strengths are. So going back to my earlier point, I see service providers have been chasing online service providers in trying to out-innovate people who were years ahead of them for years. And that's all wasted money. I mean, from day one, they should have said, we're no good at doing that. This is not going to work for us. And again, chasing someone whose business model is to generate 50 cents a year from billions of customers, when your business model is to generate $30 a month or more from customers, is absurd. So you should be thinking along the lines of, what are my unique assets to be able to sell 35 instead of 30.
But there's also a mindset thing. The term I hate the most in the entire industry is OTT.
Or digitization.
Digital as well, but I haven't got time to rant about that. But OTT, whereas here we know that actually, Google, Facebook, Amazon, they're not over the top, they're under the sea. They're also building silicon, designing their own silicon. They all have ARM infrastructure licenses and roll their own chips, their own servers. They're not like some fluffy web company. They're proper technology companies to the extent that most telcos aren't.
And also, if you subscribe to the basic definition of OTT, every service provider out there is an OTT as well.
Verizon.com is an OTT
So, I mean, that's an
website.
absurd way of slicing the market. That's absolutely not how the market is just structured. It doesn't make any sense to look at it that way.
If you use the term OTT, you should be fired. There you go. I said it.
So, both of you have been talking about sort of unique competencies, and that should drive where you invest, where you look for innovation, and that sort of thing. And what are the core competencies anymore for service providers in the various areas?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
The core competencies. I mean, I would argue that AT&T's core competency is, in fact, not running networks, which is the answer I usually get from most people at AT&T. It's your command of the regulatory process, right? So, yeah.
But again, I think the U.S. Situation is not replicable to probably anywhere else in the world. Not quite in the same way.
That may be
but that is a key competency for all of these guys, for sure.
And retail, branding, billing.
Exactly.
There's a lot of that sort of customer side of it. There's also on the enterprise side, the fixed side. They are trusted providers for sort of connectivity and more for large businesses. But
and I'm going to beat you for a second. Dean is the world's biggest contrarian devil's advocate. So I'm going to beat Dean for a second. Service providers always say customers trust us, and yet enterprise IT managers in particular, who I talk to, say the carriers are people we don't trust. We don't think that they can do very much. We want to dumb pipe it. We trust us. So again, this competency thing, we think it's one thing, but other people may think it's not.
And we're back to pipes versus platforms. one of the big potentials that I see around virtualization is that basically you sell a slice, which is in effect saying, take control over the part of our networks that you need in order to do what you know how to do better than we do. And the challenge is that that's a cultural shift within telcos that is very hard to accept. But the reality is that's how the market has operated virtually forever. So if you look at the stake is actually through these kinds of wholesale services, or close to wholesale services, is the ability to regain market share from systems integrators, et cetera, people who are seen as better intermediaries than the telcos are.
I mean, I think wholesale and reinventing wholesale is a really important thing, particularly for the mobile carriers. I'm not utterly convinced with slicing, because I think that some of the visions of slicing are a long way out. And I think there's three problems that need to be resolved. One is, do they work? The second is, can telcos actually sell them? I've never met a slicing sales VP. And third, can customers buy them? I've never met a slice purchasing manager either. So you need to educate the customers on how this thing works.
Totally agree, by the way. I mean, the promise is there. The implementation will be, where the pudding is proved or not.
And for those of you who are not familiar with the term slicing, basically what's coming in this 5G core networks era is the ability to create a massive virtual private network that preserves latency performance or bandwidth or quality of service guarantees all the way to the edge of the network, like the radio. So every radio tower that's broadcasting, you're going to have end-to-end, which we actually haven't had before. So the issue is, can we sell quality of service in this new way to people? Because in the past, we've not been able to convince people they needed to buy it from us.
So just incidentally, this is not just mobile. I mean, fixed slicing is also a thing.
True.
It's not discussed as much, but it's probably actually a shorter time frame in terms of implementation. And it's less complex to implement as well, because the variety of needs on a fixed network is much lower than the variety of needs on a mobile network.
And you haven't got to worry about mobility.
But, in answer to your question, whether the question then to me is not whether service providers will be able to sell quality of service, because if you sell a slice, you sell to an end customer the ability to decide what he needs his quality of service to be. So you, in a sense, you shift that question from, I will design something that meets your quality of service requirements, to, I will let you set up quality of service however you want to do it. In a sense, you're outsourcing a certain part of what you used to do. Basically, layer 2 service design is no longer your responsibility. It becomes your customer's responsibility. And that's where Dean is absolutely right. It's not certain that the customers are aware of that and capable of doing that or have the skill set to do that. Some of them will. I mean, today, some banks actually lease dark fiber and build networks completely on the basis of that. These people will know how to deal with this kind of stuff.
The problem is though scalability. Do you need to do this successfully 10 slices, 100, 1,000, or 1 million? Because as it gets to larger numbers, you require the network resource management to be heavily automated. You probably need all sorts of clever AI software. And then if some of your slices are being used for things like critical infrastructure, for the power grid or healthcare applications, your slicing resource management and AI algorithms are part of critical national infrastructure, at which point the feds phone you up and say, we want to look at the code because you've created a single point of failure for the entire country.
And in the fixed space, I've interviewed a good dozen of operators on this topic. In the fixed space, we're talking tens at the most. So that is, again, not as critical today. But as soon as you move into critical mobile applications, each application is so different in terms of what it requires that indeed you are obligated to look at multiple tens, if not hundreds, of slices running concurrently. And that is a huge question mark in terms of how we manage that.
Yeah, and in terms of both, the first thing, does the software work? And also, is there a malware risk? or additional actors. I think that some of this is behind some of the international concerns, let's put it that way, that are occurring with network control planes at the moment.
So, gentlemen, we're at 18 seconds. I just want to thank you for being here. These are two of the people in the world I respect the most in terms of their thinking. All right, their jobs are to spend all day thinking about the future of communications. So, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.